Hello everyone, welcome back to the TJOmega channel for day 1314 of our daily content grind. Today, it is time to pit you against each other once again in a heated Transformers debate that will not at all have people throwing pitchforks and spears in the comment section. You guys are actually kind of cool about this, so that usually doesn't happen. So we usually keep it nice and civil. Everyone's opinion is their own. There is no right or wrong. There is only agreeing and disagreeing, and no one is forced to agree or disagree with anything except me because I'm the YouTuber. You have to agree with what I say. So, I just wanted to see if I could get away with that line. So, last time we talked about what type of combination do you prefer? Do you want the Scramble City style, or do you want dedicated engineering, meaning no rearrangement of parts, but more efficient in how it works at the sacrifice of play value? I'm actually kind of surprised. You know, it's essentially like a 65-35 split here, which is close to 2/3 of you saying, yeah, like dedicated engineering better. And I will admit, yeah, like that does lead to toys and combiners that are a lot more secure, look a lot cleaner, and can do more interesting things with their combinations. But I do admit I'm kind of in the middle on this one. I don't really have much preference because there's advantages to both, you know? Like, you can do Scrambled City in a really good, solid, modern way. Third parties have done it. Honestly, think Combiner Wars was close. You know, if some of the engineering tricks that they're doing with Kaiser coming up were part of Combiner Wars. You know, like being able to have like a dedicated bicep section instead of just the thighs of the robot. That I think would make them far better. You know, like I think they were close to making something really cool. But I like the play value. I like the play value and the pattern of Scramble City. So I can go with either, honestly. You know, I think it depends on how well you do it, because dedicated engineering also comes with a few back flaws. I was going for another word, scrap it. Let's forget it. Comes with the a few other flaws. But you guys have decided that is it. Officially, because this is as official as it gets. Dedicated combiner engineering is clearly better. Now, that said, I want to go back to a character one. So we did Megatron in the similar kind of debate. Today, it's Starscream's turn. And this one, I think, is almost more interesting than Megatron. See, we have backstory to Megatron now that kind of depicts him as something of a more sympathetic character. He's not always just been like the tyrant who's evil for the sake of being evil. You know, he had a purpose for the rebellion. He had a purpose for rising up against Autobots. Starscream, on the other hand, is a character known to be one of the biggest traitors in fictional history. If Starscream is around, you can put good money on whether or not he will stab his leader in the back at some point in a desperate grasp for power. That's just what we expect of him. Now, when the fiction supports it and lets him go all the way with it, you do end up with some pretty incredible storytelling. You know, the G1 comic book series for the Underbase is something of a legendary storyline for Starscream and for the Marvel comic fans out there. Like, Starscream gains this immense amount of power and puts it to good use. Like, we did a video a long time ago, I want to say like the most successful Starscream's ever been, like the best days Starscream's ever had, something along that nature, something of that nature. But the point of that video was to just kind of show how good Starscream did in some situations. When he had the Underbase, his body count was absurd, like something like over 24 Autobots that he managed to kill. And a couple of Decepticons here and there as well that were in his way. Underbase Starscream was hoo. Now, and that's what happens when you get to Starscream at his peak of villainy. You know, because he's power mad and he wants to use that power, he doesn't have the restraint of Megatron. So sometimes the things that he resorts to are far more drastic, far riskier, and far more intimidating. You know, you look at what he was trying to do with the war world in G2. It's kind of scary what Starscream can do when he's at full villain. We saw it as somewhat in the IDW books as well. In the earlier books, Starscream is what you would expect him to be. He's power hungry, he's treacherous, he plays strategically. Now, he is much more of a long game player in the IDW books, and also capable of spotting an advantage and improvising. He does both. And commending IDW writing once again, that's pretty much how Starscream should be depicted if he's going to be a villain. That said, as the book went on, Starscream does have a shift where it's not so much wanting to destroy the Autobots, it's really just wanting to be rid of Megatron so he can rise to his own authority. And what happens to the Autobots after that is not really any of his concern anymore. It eventually leads to him taking over the planet, actually becoming king of Cybertron, like literal Lord Starscream. But there's a shift. There's a shift between his unsuspected friendship with Bumblebee and the interventions of Windblade. You end up with a Starscream at the end of the story who is actually remorseful for the things that he did to rise to power. We have a Starscream that realized who he was really supposed to be. And in the final stories that he participates in, he is actually something that Starscream almost never is. Self-sacrificing for the greater good. He makes this face turn, and maybe it's not deserved because he committed so many atrocities, but similar to the Megatron idea. Just because you've done horrible things doesn't mean you shouldn't try to be better. And that's kind of where Starscream went eventually as well. He just took a much longer route to get there. But it makes for a fascinating Starscream. There's more depth to him. And that's where we get into the actual twist and debate here of, can Starscream actually be a redeemable character? You know, or is it better to keep him in his traditional storyline? You know, because let's be honest, some of the most legendary Starscreams, some of the ones the fandom still talks about the most, are the times where Starscream showed a side of himself that wasn't actually evil. Armada is a great place to find an example of that. Armada Starscream is something of a legendary level character in Transformers fandoms because it's so well written. For as much as we want to grief on Armada, and I will fully admit I'm not a big fan of the show. The translation is really rushed and rough. The animation is rough. The writing I don't think is all that well handled. But Starscream, I think a lot of people, even the detractors of that show, will agree that Starscream is the saving grace and just such a standout. It's a Starscream that only hates Megatron, not really the Autobots, not really lusting for power. Once he's got his mini-cons and starts like befriending them instead of treating them as tools, you see him shift to like a much more like well-meaning side. And you find out he's really only power hungry from after Megatron because he hates Megatron as a person. He ends up kind of being a good guy at the end, and it was really refreshing, and we still talk about that. We loved Armada Starscream so much that we all kind of agree it's one of the biggest writing mistakes in Transformer history to immediately make him a villain again in Energon. A mind-wiped, loyal villain. No less. Like, this is just a toady. Like, this is just, like, a loyal generic soldier to Megatron. This Starscream is a blank personality, and oh, it sucked. It's such a missed opportunity. That said, it's not the only time it's happened. You know, let's take a look at, say, the Netflix trilogy of shows. Now, that was not a very well-written series either. There's a lot of, like, really bad writing going on in that show. But again, Starscream is doing something a little bit more interesting. He's not power hungry toward the end of the series. He's the one to, similar to Armada, He's the one who realizes the threat of Unicron before anybody else, through his visions of the future. And it does lead to him turning the table. Like, it leads to him confronting Megatron, not because he wants power, but because he needs everyone to work together toward a common enemy if everyone's going to survive. The series ends with a peace meeting between Autobot and Decepticon, and Starscream was the entire linchpin behind it. The planet is at peace because Starscream stepped up to make it that way. And that's a little bit interesting. See, we know Starscream's traditional characterization, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating when we actually do see a more heroic or a more peaceful side of him, because it's interesting to see what you're going to actually do with such a huge twist on a classic and very well-known characterization. But that said, when that characterization is missing, in the case of like Energon Starscream, we have, we have that depiction in Armada to go like, why isn't he like that anymore? Like, he should be an Autobot in this case, right? He shouldn't be a Decepticon. Not with his backstory, not with what he's already been through. But when that side of Starscream, that backstabbing, that treachery, when that character of Starscream is just flat and doesn't really have anything going for him, we don't look at that Starscream and go, man, I really wish he'd turn on Megatron and join the Autobots. No. We wish he would become a backstabbing traitor that's after power. We don't pine for the Starscream that could actually be a hero, when his characterization is left flat and blank, like it is in the live-action movies. We kind of want to see him the way that we expect to see him, It's what makes movie Starscream so disappointing character-wise. I know there's comic books that amend that, but what happens on the screen is what's canon on, to the live-action movies. And in those, he's just a sniveling toady of a henchman. He doesn't even have any, real menace or presence to him because he just spends most of his time cowering around Megatron. It's pathetic. It ain't Starscream, But the point being, when I see Starscreams like this that are just kind of bland and not really doing anything character-wise, I don't go, man, I wish he'd be a good guy. No, I wish he'd go, shoot Megatron in the back already. That said, sometimes that's the wrong decision. I'm sorry to make you remember the Machinima cartoon. I can't hate it completely because a friend of mine got to voice Optimus Prime, which I know was his dream. For one season, anyway. But I think we acknowledge that the writing is bad. They use a lot of non-union VAs who were not good. It's just a very, very low-tier Transformer cartoon. And one of the biggest things that frustrated me and upset me about this series is the depiction of Starscream. You had a Starscream who was on the Council of Cybertron. He was the Decepticon leader. Only two other characters had authority over him, and they were essentially equal in authority to begin with. There's a council of three. It's not even like there's an entire council voting against Starscream. It's Rodimus and the Mistress of Flame. That's it. If he just waited for Rodimus to get bored of being a leader, he'd go back to Hot Rod again, and now it's just two. But he has everything he wants. He's in a stable position. There's absolutely no reason to be the backstabbing, power-hungry traitor that he normally is. And then he became the backstabbing, power-hungry traitor he normally is, and it was horrible. Because it made no sense to the story. Why would Starscream make a power grab when he already has all the power he could ever need? Bad. That time, going to the typical evil depiction was the bad idea. And we have a more recent one. Hi, Earthspark. I know, I defend Earthspark. I happen to like it. But even the people who like Earthspark, we can all agree two things. Number one, what they were doing with Starscream in Season 1 was actually interesting. And number two, Season 2 is really bad compared to Season 1. It just is. I hate to admit it, but it is. I can still watch it. I can still enjoy it. But compared to what I thought they did really, really well in season 1, I think season 2 is massively dropping the ball. And one of the biggest things was Starscream's depiction. Here was a Starscream who was in a situation where there was no war to fight. There was no power to grab. So what do you do with him then? Well, he's put in a situation where he has to rely on someone else to survive, and that's hashtag. He has a genuine friendship that starts blooming with hashtag because they do have some similar characteristics to them, they get pointed out. And in a moment, he's actually self-sacrificing. He risks himself against the Dweller to save hashtag and let her escape. That's kind of enormous. That's kind of huge. That's not something I would expect out of a Starscream. And more important, it's the first time I ever saw a Starscream tackle the victim side of the character, the physical abuse and trauma that he had gone through because of Megatron, that Megatron himself dealt out. Even though he's a good guy, and even though he can promise that Starscream would be like safe, under the Autobot watch, he doesn't believe him. Nowhere's safe when it's around you. That's his abuser. Like, we've never really seen Starscream depicted as an abuse survivor, and it makes all the sense in the world. It makes all the sense in the world. Megatron has been punching Starscream since G1. Since season 1. But this is the first show that went that way. The first show that actually looked at that side of Starscream. And we threw it away. Could have had a good Starscream. Could have had a good guy Starscream. Would have had a justified reason for making him a good guy. Threw it away. Generic villain, power hungry. Again. Sometimes it's the wrong call. Sometimes it's very much the right call. Again, when you let Starscream go full Starscream, you can tell some amazing stories and create a really, really dynamic character. Prime Starscream has a lot to him. The constant, lording over everybody with, I vanquished Cliff Jumper. So proud of the fact that he killed an Autobot. He has to flaunt it just to show off. He gains leadership. He loses leadership. He has to, struggle with his own, his own side of the battle. He has, and in a really weird way, like he depicts like all of the scheming and cowardice of typical Starscreams, and in a really exaggerated way. That's a lot of fun. So yeah, there's ways of even twisting the standard formula and still making it a really interesting and dynamic Starscream. Doesn't necessarily have to have a face turn in order to actually be that way. As long as I'm using wrestling terminology, let me wrap it up with this. Starscream, I feel like, is one of those characters who has this natural charisma to him, even though he is just a backstabbing jerk. But that said, you can't deny he's fun to watch. He is like a wrestling character who is villainous, but he's so good at being villainous, people start to cheer him. For your old school wrestling fans, that's your Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock. For newer wrestling fans, you see that in Randy Orton or these days MJF. They're just so good at being so bad that we actually get really happy when we see them being the way they are. And that's kind of how we always view Starscream. We love to see him, as, the traitor of the Transformer franchise. But in the niche circles, in places that that aren't the mainstream Transformers, the Armada series, IDW's later run, Earthspark for season 1, we have these depictions that show a different side, and they are depictions that a lot of people still talk about, and I don't think that can be discounted. So, where does Starscream lie? Is he better to always leave as the backstabbing traitor, or is there room to actually have him be more of a character that can find redemption? I'll admit, I haven't figured out how I'm going to word it in the poll yet. I'm just recording this. I'll figure it out when it gets uploaded. For now, though, As always with these debates, you will find a straw poll link in the description of this video. Please give it a click, go vote for yourself. This is a one or the other, it's just whichever one you prefer the most. I understand there's a middle ground. Flip a coin. Flip a coin. I just want to see which side of the fence is more popular. So, there we go. That is your debate for the day. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.
Hello everyone, I am Astral Agent Magnetar, a Tokusatsu VTuber, and I am streaming 4 times a week over on Twitch, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday afternoons, and a special late night one on late Friday/early Saturday. So come watch, come hang out, and let's make an impact together.